no matter how it's implemented. It's an unnecessary law. There's no two ways about this. We already have laws in place. Protect, number one, protect the taxpayers, but also protect their small businesses. But this is just an overreach again by the federal government. The criminal penalties, you think about this, are completely inappropriate.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. NFIB and our members advocate to keep America's small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
Welcome to the Small Business Rundown, a bi-weekly podcast with information on independent businesses' victories and challenges in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB Senior Vice President for Advocacy. Our guests today are discussing the new Small Business Ownership Registry, which went into effect on January 1st of this year. This new registry process is an extra burden on small businesses, and both the U.S. House and Senate have introduced bills to repeal it. United States Senator Tommy Tuberville of Alabama and Representative Warren Davidson of Ohio's 8th District sponsored a bill to repeal the law that requires this new registry, and they'll explain why they're pushing for this change. Also, NFIB's Vice President of Federal Government Relations, Jeff Brabant, is here to discuss the impact this would have on small businesses. Hey, Jeff, it's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff, to start, can you give us a brief recap of what the new reporting requirement is and what it means for small businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're a business or an LLC with 20 or fewer employees and $5 million or less in revenue, you're going to have to register your business and your beneficial owners with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network by the end of the year. So you might be saying, well, what is a beneficial owner? Well, that's defined as anyone with a 25% equity stake or greater, or anyone with substantial control. Now you're probably asking me, Jeff, what is substantial control? Well, that's pretty vaguely defined to the point of where it could mean a general counsel. It could mean a senior manager. So there are going to be quite a few people who have to register with FinCEN, and you as the business owner, it's your responsibility to make sure they all register on time by the end of the year. And the information you're going to have to register include a business address and a copy of your driver's license, which has to be photocopied and sent into FinCEN, and a date of birth. So this has to be for all beneficial owners of your company, and you have till the end of the year to get this done.
So after that first year, how often will business owners have to update their ownership information in the database?
For the life of the business, if any information ever changes. So if your driver's license expires, you have 30 days to tell FinCEN. If you move your business address changes, you have 30 days to tell FinCEN. So that's one of the most concerning things in the longer term is that hopefully business owners remember that, hey, you go to the DMV, you better call FinCEN. So that's going to be a real challenge for small business owners in the long term because there are serious penalties for noncompliance.
Now, small business owners have already submitted this information to other state and federal agencies. Why are they being asked to submit it to yet another part of the federal government?
That's because most of this ownership information with the IRS and other agencies is extremely private, and it requires a subpoena from a judge if you want to access it. So right now, let's say if the FBI wants to investigate a business because they think there's wrongdoing going on, they want to get their IRS ownership information, they have to go to a judge and prove probable cause to get that. What this registry will allow intelligence and law enforcement is unfettered access to the information of over 32 million small business owners to basically just come up with any reason and they can access it.
Can you speak to how burdensome it'll be for small businesses to make updates? You mentioned earlier that they have to do it whenever things change, but this information could include addresses, expired driver's license. What kind of added burden is that for small businesses?
Yeah, that's just going to be very difficult because it's not something you normally think of. You go to the DMV to update your driver's license. You're not thinking, oh, well, now I got to go call FinCEN and make sure they have a copy of my new license. It's also going to be a challenge for your senior staff. This substantial control prong is significant. Do you have a general counsel who has to file? Do you have someone who manages your restaurant who has substantial control of your operations who has to file? It's one thing if you're the business owner, but you're going to have to remind all of your folks. You're going to have to keep track of your senior staff to make sure and remind them when your driver's license expires, hey, you got to let me know so I could update FinCEN. This is going to be extremely difficult to manage for business owners.
Knowing that federal, state, and local, potentially foreign law enforcement agencies can access this information, how concerned are you or are we about the small business owner's loss of privacy?
Of course, there's always the worry about a leak, right? We hear almost every day about a new government agency leaked some information for some purpose. Of course, there's hacks. People get hacked all the time. You probably see something in the mail almost every day about your information being compromised. Then, of course, there's the concern about misuse of information. There's going to be thousands of people who have access to this database. Will they be using it properly? We're trying to put in safeguards to ensure that they do, but That's putting a lot of trust into intelligence agencies to make sure they're not improperly accessing this information.
Jeff, what are the penalties small business owners would be subject to if they've not heard about this rule and they don't comply?
Failure to knowingly and willingly comply will result in $591 a day fine, up to $10,000, and as much as 2 years in prison.
You said knowing and willing standard. Can you expand upon that?
Sure. Right now, knowing and willing, it sounds like it reads.
Yeah.
You knew you had to file and you willingly filed, or vice versa. You knew you had to file and you willingly chose to not file. So there can be concern. Let's say your driver's license expires and you do the right thing, and within 30 days, you make sure that FinCEN has a new photocopy of it. Let's say several years later, some of your other information changes, your business address changes, and you forget within 30 days to update information. If the prosecutor wanted to throw the book at you, they could say, look, they knew they had to update this information. They've done it in the past. So they knew it, they had to do it, and they willingly chose not to do it. Here's a $10,000 fine, or worse, here's 2 years in prison.
So it's not just remembering to do it one time, but you have to remember to do it every single time after that.
For the life of your business.
That's unbelievable. Now I'd like to thank U.S. Representative Warren Davidson for joining us on today's show. Congressman, thanks for joining us to talk about this new requirement.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think it's an important topic for people to pay attention to.
Well, as someone who started and ran a small business before, can you tell me how burdensome a reporting requirement like this will be for small businesses, or is for small businesses?
Yeah, so I mean, fundamentally, the Corporate Transparency Act passed, and it requires FinCEN, which is short for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, to build a database that results in every small business owner having to report to an agency most have never heard of. And it wouldn't be intuitive for a small business owner to think they would need to reach out to something called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network unless they were engaged in a certain area of business. So the obligation now is to register with these companies and share who are the beneficial owners. We did succeed in getting a definition for that. So anyone that's a 25% or more owner or exercises control over the voting rights of that amount of the business is considered a beneficial owner. But when this thing started, I mean, it was basically anyone who exerts any significant amount of influence over the business, and it wasn't well defined. So it is still a big problem, and it has criminal penalties, including jail time and substantial fines. So if you fail to report, you could be considered a criminal.
Currently, business ownership information is already on file with nearly every Secretary of State in America, with the IRS, and with the banks that customers do business with. So why does another government agency need business owners' information?
The stated claim is that they'll be able to catch people that are engaged in illicit finance or illicit trade. So, for example, a company that is laundering money for the cartels through a shell company, somehow they're not going to get tripped up through regular means, but because they have to file this report about who the beneficial owners are, somehow that will make it so that they can catch all these people. I'm pretty suspicious about the idea, and frankly, so are the courts. District Court in Alabama has said they think this is an unconstitutional mandate. It's essentially a presumption that you have something to hide as a criminal activity. So everyone, blanket case, no probable cause, no due process. You have to come fill out a report with a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. So I think there's a lot of fallacious assumptions in here, and I think it's way overly broad in terms of the mandate on businesses. And to your point, since it's already collected in so many other ways, it's also very inefficient.
Right. And are there privacy concerns?
Yeah, absolutely. There's privacy concerns. And if you think about it, there are reasons why people create companies, and you might register the company with the Secretary of State using a law firm, and the registered agent would be the law firm. Now, if the government really has some kind of probable cause to go after this business for some kind of illicit activity, then they would get a warrant or a subpoena, and they would go to the law firm. The law firm, having received a warrant or a subpoena, would be obligated to disclose who are the beneficial owners of the company. Mm-hmm. They want all that information up front so they can essentially build a searchable database, and then they'll claim that it's not a search, it's just a query. They'll build everything they want to know, basically circumventing the constitutional protections of the Fourth Amendment.
And circling back to the burden this is for small businesses, they have to update FinCEN regularly whenever they update their own information. How much of a burden do you think that is for small businesses?
Well, look, the claim is, well, you're already doing your taxes, so you can just have your CPA do that. Well, if you're going to do it through the tax code and you're already using your CPA to do that, why not just use the IRS? You already have to disclose the same kind of information, to the IRS. And FinCEN does work with the IRS, and the IRS has a law enforcement function, at times. So the obligation seems like it will get caught by people that are paying, an outside firm to do their taxes. I know when I did mine this year, my CPA said, "Hey, you need to, fill out this form for FinCEN." The trouble is that you don't always do taxes on all the things that you own. Some of the businesses don't even have revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And so my CPA didn't notify me about all the companies that I have a beneficial ownership of. And, because of the work I do, I'm obviously well aware of the legal requirement here. So, that's the burden for me, is to say, well, now how do I go through complying with it? I've been in Congress and I'm not even sure what I have to do to comply with it this year.
In talking with your colleagues about this, what is your response when they say that it's the real problem here is implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act, not the act itself?
Well, look, I will concede that the federal government has problems implementing even really basic things at times. But the problem with this is that it's designed to be overbroad. So it really isn't an easy thing to implement in any way, shape, or form. And, they knew that when they launched it. So FinCEN created this thing. They initially created a rule called the Customer Due Diligence Rule and put the burden on banks. And because banks are some of the biggest lobbying firms in the world, they spent a fortune trying to get Congress to change this. Not so much that they cared exactly what the outcome was, they just didn't want the burden to be on them. And so they succeeded in transferring that burden to businesses. So they thought, by passing the Corporate Transparency Act, now after the fact, they say everyone's just pushing it back on them to collect the same information anyway. And so, that's kind of the challenge. Is the federal government is so used to pushing banks to do their surveillance work for them on anything financial that they don't really have a good mechanism to say, well, how do we, an agency that's normally working with institutions, somehow build a retail facing function where we're going to collect all this information from literally every business in America?
Mm-hmm. Congressman, how important is it that your colleagues hear from small businesses about their concerns on this?
Basically, the people most affected need to speak loudly. And I think, NFIB is really important so that they kind of synthesize that, because you guys do know the system, you come and engage, you get on everyone's calendars. Regular business owners are busy running their business. And particularly the people in the crosshairs of this are people with 20 or fewer employees who have the biggest burden in an ongoing way to do these reporting obligations. And so they're especially busy with the day-to-day functions of the business. I think it's important to make your voice heard however you can. But if every single business was able to start saying, I want to get on your calendar and talk about how this is wrecking, my time, then I think it would really make a difference across the country if every member of Congress is hearing that from business owners across their districts.
Well, we know you're busy as well, so we'll let you go. But before we do, is there anything else you'd like to add or conclude with?
No, I really appreciate the chance to highlight this issue. I hope there's a legislative path to get it done. And frankly, as we confront other issues, maybe we could do something that's in a bundle of small business packages. I think one of the most important things we need to do for businesses this year, aside from lower this regulatory burden, is fix the tax code, because we know that the full and immediate expensing, the research and development credit, and the interest deductibility problems are real for small privately held businesses, first and foremost. So hopefully we can put all this stuff together and get something done that really gets our economy back on the right track.
Well, thank you very much both for your leadership on the issue and for taking the time to chat with us today. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate you guys. Take care.
I'd like to welcome to the podcast Senator Tommy Tuberville. Senator, thanks for joining us today to talk about the Corporate Transparency Act. You've taken the lead in the Senate, along with Representative Warren Davidson in the House, to sponsor this bill that repeals the Corporate Transparency Act. As you know, the new reporting law requires updates for the life of the business and any time that information changes. What are your concerns about the extra burden this will create for small business owners?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on and talk about this travesty, that was stuck into the NDAA, which is the budget for the military, a year or so ago. But now it's coming to fruition of what small business owners across the country have to do by the end of this year. So, small business owners, they're focused on really what matters, growing their business and providing for their families and obviously supporting their community. There's 33 million small businesses across the country. And, they face all kind of bureaucratic red tape already as it is. And they don't have time really to adjust here in midstream just because this federal government wants to put more red tape on top of that. So having to go to a website, which is what they're going to have to do, of a government agency, most Americans have never even heard of this bureaucratic agency called FinCEN. And at the end of this year, the small business have to do, they have to update their profile every time something changes with their LLC or their business, they have to give driver's license, government IDs, they have to give addresses. I mean, there's a plethora of things that they have to do to fill out this form. And if one thing on it changes, they have to completely redo it at the end of the year.
Right.
But that's what, that's what they want. This Corporate Transparency Act requires all this, and it makes you file. And what it does, it puts a huge burden on people that have these LLCs to know that if you don't do this, if you don't respond to the federal government the way you're supposed to at the end of the year, then what they're going to do is they're going to charge you with a 2-year prison sentence or a $10,000 fine. Now, this is devastating to a lot of people that, have land or have some kind of trust in the LLC or a small business. They don't need any more of this.
Right, Senator. And you mentioned the time that it takes, the threat that there is to small businesses. Do you also see this as a security issue?
Oh, yeah. All this data goes to this bureaucracy that's called FinCEN. All this stuff is stored on government servers. It's going to be obviously prime target for hackers, which we see almost daily in our country now. The IRS and the Office of Personnel Management both have been hacked just recently. But this database will be targets for criminals daily. And, I have zero confidence that the government has appropriate safeguards. But the one thing I also will tell you on this is most people, and I meet daily with people that I bring this up, small business owners, people from Alabama, people from other states that come into my office talking about things, they have no clue about this Corporate Transparency Act. It has not been pushed out to the public. People don't really know that this government could care less about you knowing about it. They want you to be delinquent on it where they can get into your business and you're going to have a tough time, overcoming the IRS and all these other agencies the government's going to send after you.
Right. And you mentioned criminals in the form of hackers. What about the criminals that this law is trying to target? I don't mean this as a silly question, but are they realistically going to report their real identities to FinCEN?
Yeah, of course not. And, they say it's going after these criminal entities that really don't go by any laws. And do you really think that these shell companies that are really hide this criminal activity, you think that they're going to register? They're not going to do that. I mean, they change like the wind. These corporations, these entities of these shell companies, they change. They might even change monthly of the names, the address, all those things. So if the feds are serious about cracking down on these activities, you do that by tracking large dollar bank transactions. That's how you do that, which the Treasury Department FinCEN office already does. So we really don't need this. The CTA, which I call the Corporate Transparency Act, it's not a serious attempt to crack down on crime. It's just another unnecessary grab by the federal government to get all your data.
And speaking of data, the state attorneys general will have access to this information. These are folks that are usually politically elected positions. They serve as law enforcement officials for the states, and they'll have access. Do you have any concerns about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, frankly, it's my top concern. I know that's something that we'd like to think that would never happen to us because we're American citizens. But our country and our judicial system is weaponized now. It's weaponized for political purposes. And it's been doing that since I've been up here 3.5 years, right before our eyes, about how they're politicizing everything they possibly can to get as much information, to make you pay as much taxes, or even penalize you because you might be a little bit late on that. So Americans need to wake up before it's too late.
And earlier you told us that you meet with folks about this every day, so you've probably heard this argument, but how do you respond to other members of Congress or people that are in agencies who say the problem is the implementation of the Corporate Transparency Act and not necessarily the burdensome law itself?
Yeah, well, they're missing the point. No matter how it's implemented, it's an unnecessary law. There's no two ways about this. We already have laws in place. Number one, protect the taxpayers, but also protect their small businesses. But this is just an overreach again by the federal government. The criminal penalties, you think about this, are completely inappropriate. You could just think about if you have a small parcel of land and an LLC and you forget to send that data in, you're looking down the barrel of a gun of a 2-year prison sentence or $10,000 fine and the IRS coming in on top of you. And it will be penalty after penalty. Lawyers will have to be hired. Accountants will have to be hired. This, again, is just an overreach by the federal government on small businesses. And the Biden administration, since I've been here, has been after small business. And if you go back and think about it, small business is anything from farmers to small delis, anything like that. You don't think they're not already struggling to make ends meet? Now, here's another way that accountants and lawyers are going to have to be paid to turn that data in. And if you breach that time limit, then it's going to be just one thing after another to keep your business afloat.
That's a good point. And when you're considering whether to sponsor a bill or bills like this, what is the impact of hearing from small business owners?
Well, as I said, they're the backbone of what this country is about. You just think of all the small businesses. As I said, in my state alone, we have 400,000. Across the country, we have 33 million small businesses. Now, again, if you own just 25% of an LLC, a lot of people go in together and put these LLCs together where they're buying land or whatever. If you're only a 25% owner, you still have to send this data in. And then what happens if one of the others in the LLC does not send their data in? All of you are responsible for that. But many of my colleagues up here feel the same way. I've even talked to some of the Democrats. They can't believe that this was put into the late at night in the budget bill for the military. It was slipped in. Nobody knew about it. And again, you can ask really anybody up here. I bet 10% of the senators and congressmen that you would go talk to about the Corporate Transparency Act, they'd look at you like you're crazy. What are you talking about? And I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats. So that's how things work here in Washington, D.C. It's not done the right way. It's done in the middle of the night. But we have got to make sure our small businesses thrive in this economy. Our economy is going to get worse. Our country's in trouble when it comes to inflation. We're $35 trillion in debt. We're printing $80,000 a second. And I'll say that one more time. $80,000 a second is how much money that we're printing to keep this economy going.
And it's also why we appreciate your efforts to stop this beneficial ownership information reporting requirement. Before we need to go, I know you have plenty to do. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, this is just one thing. The Corporate Transparency Act is just one thing. It sounds small. And again, it just talks about data. It doesn't have anything to do with paying any more money as a small business. But at the end of the day, it's going to cost you money for an accounting office and for your lawyers to have to do things like this. We even heard from people who said their accountants said they don't know about it. They've not heard about it. And they don't really know how to go through this process. So again, it has to be done at the end of this year. I want the people to be educated about it, not just Republicans, but also Democrats, people across this country that own small businesses.
And for that, we thank you, Senator Tuberville. I appreciate your time and thank you for your efforts on this issue.
Okay, thank you. God bless.
All right, have a good day, Coach. Jeff, before we go, we've heard a lot about the threat that this is to small business owners and the burden that it can be. How can listeners take action to support repealing this ownership reporting requirement?
Absolutely. I'd recommend that you go to our website and you go to nfib.com/protectprivacy and you fill out an action alert and tell your member of Congress exactly what their issue is. And you urge them to support this bill that will repeal it.
It's always good to hear from members of Congress on these issues. And Jeff, we appreciate you joining us as well. For listeners that want to, they can support the repeal of this new small business registry requirement by using our action alert linked in the show notes. And our next episode premieres on June 13th. We'll discuss the top 5 ways Congress and the White House can help Main Street fight inflation. We'll also answer questions from our listeners on the topic, so if there's anything you'd like us to cover on the podcast, send us an email at podcast@nfib.org. We look forward to hearing from you. And now I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's Small Business Rundown. We'll be back every 2 weeks bringing you news and analysis from Washington, D.C. and state capitals so that you, whether you're a business owner or a supporter of one, can continue to blaze a trail.
The Small Business Rundown is brought to you by NFIB, the voice of small business. You can find us at nfib.com and on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.